All right, so lecture 19, this is the lecture in which I try to introduce this class of things called collective goods. What are those collective goods exactly? And the issues with regard to collective goods. And I will also give you a mathematical example, a simple computational example of what is called the tragedy of the commons, a well-known game in game theory that as well, but we will give it a twist. And hopefully we can show the issues related to collective goods. Hopefully that is shown very clearly in this simple game, so to say. So first part is about what are exactly those collective goods that we want to talk about. And in order to do that, it's good to go back to the beginning and to talk again about what exactly are economic goods. And I introduced economic goods as anything with direct or indirect use value. So what makes something economic? It is this use value. And this use value describes in some sense well-being, wealth, right? I also defined wealth as the total mass of use value in some sense that is generated in the economy. Now, this is a very difficult subject because how do you measure it? That is not clear at all. But anyway, use value is the key. And what we did was suggest that there are two fundamental types of economic goods, therefore. The first one is that of a consumable. Consumable has direct use value. It is something that you use to create well-being. And as a consequence, it is featured in those utility functions. It is subject to preferences. The second category was that of the intermediary goods. Goods that have indirect use value in the sense that they can be used in the production of consumables. So consumables have a primary role because they are the goal of the whole economic enterprise: to create, to produce, to provide consumables, because those are the expression of this use value that is directly related to use value. And in order to do that, we need to have a production process, of course, and in that production process, you use these secondary goods, the intermediary inputs, the intermediary goods. And so we are, we built our theory completely around this. We created the production network. In that production network, the outputs were consumables, but the production network itself describes in all detail how those intermediary goods are used to produce those consumables and who is exactly involved with that. And as a consequence, we were able to see that intermediary good pricing is quite flexible because there is no market forces really working on them. There are only indirect market forces working on intermediary goods, no direct market value forces. And this gives them power to people because they can control those intermediary good supplies or the purchasing of these goods, and use that power, this monopoly power, this monopsony power, to set prices for those intermediary goods. And that leads then to inequality in the economy, even in competitive economies, as we can call that. All right, so that was the story so far. But there is a second dimension that we so far did not really explore that much. We just said, okay, the economic goods that were floating around in the production network, they are tradable, they're property rights that can be exchanged. And as a consequence, those are commodities. So we had a special category of goods that were commodities, and commodities are privately tradable goods. And we also had to impose that they were measurable, of course. Now, contrary to that tradable good, there is the non-tradable. And the non-tradable, we put that away in some sense in the model. It was always there somewhere, but it was not a feature in the model because it was not tradable. The only thing that we really looked at was tradable commodities, and the non-tradables were subsumed in what we call home production. So this home production subsumes all these things that are not tradable. Yeah? And so I had stories about using your own land or your own labor to produce commodities, and that was called home production using non-tradables. Now, when we start to talk about collective goods, it is all about non-tradables, right? Because the non-tradables, there are a lot of things that are in principle non-tradable in the sense of that individuals can exercise property rights and that they can exchange those property rights that we assume to be the case when commodities are tradable. Now, so the category of non-tradables, that is featured in today's presentations. That is what we are focusing on. So let's go back to look at the tradable commodity or tradable good. It is measurable, first of all. It is property rights can be defined and can be attached to quantities of that good. Yeah, and that can be then transacted in a market. Those were tradable goods. Yeah. Now, this leads to the second dimension then, the commodities versus the non-commodities. And I want to now, this property right gives me an idea for making an in-between step, because I can now divide the non-tradables into a more precise description. And the first category is that of what we can call the sources. Private property rights can be exercised, but quantities cannot be traded in the economy's infrastructure. So you cannot go to market and sell something. Usually that is legal or traditional or cultural, right? For example, in the Middle Ages, there were no labor markets. And there were actually also no markets for land, right? So land and labor were really not tradable. However, clearly there were defined legal property rights with regard to labor and land, right? So there was always a landowner, and the landowner was recognized by the authority structures in that economy. In the Middle Ages, that was a king or his representatives. And the landowner could go to the king to claim certain things. But the land was not, you could not sell very straightforwardly land. The land was given to a certain person. The person can claim the benefits from the land, the produce, but he could trade the produce, but he could not sell the land necessarily. So here an example of a resource. The same holds for labor. A person clearly owns his or her own labor, except when they're a slave, right? So, but one step up from the slave is a serf, or the peasant, and the peasant in the medieval economy clearly had the right to his own labor, right? And so had private property rights to his own or her own labor. However, the labor cannot simply be traded, cannot simply be sold. Yeah. Then there is a whole bunch of things that are not subject to private property rights. And we can call these property rights communal or common. So when in the Middle Ages, that was usually the king then, this common or communal or global property right. In our modern economy, it is areas of the world that are still not claimed, so to say. They become more and more rare, or goods, resources that are owned by countries, public authorities, governments. Yeah, so nation states own land. They, for example, nature reserves are a good example, but there's a lot of land owned by governments that are used for economic purposes. Local governments, councils, local authorities can also exercise a lot of these rights and can use these resources for economic purposes. Those are called collective goods. So resources, what I call resources, the only difference between what I call a collective good and a resource is this property right, but it's very closely related. It is really the tradability that affects this whole situation. Yeah? Private property rights cannot be exercised, really, even in the case of a resource. Yeah? So resources and collective goods together form a very broad category that is this of the non-tradables. Yeah. Property rights are very difficult. It depends on the law, and the law itself is a collective good. I want to emphasize that. If you have a property law, a law describing what is a property right, or assigning a property right, this is a collective good. This is something that is collectively recognized and collectively enforced, and it is a resource. It is an intermediary good for economic wealth creation. So I want to emphasize that even the property rights themselves, how they are structured, how they are formulated, are collective goods. Yeah. And this refers then to the complete absence of property rights. So the law on property rights, there is no property right to that. And so we can put that in the category of global property rights. So global property rights really also refer to things that are no property rights with regard to. Yeah. So that is the third thing I want to remark here. Okay. 2 dimensions. Let me then try to do it. Yeah.
One thing. Isn't that in contrary to one another, that the property laws are a public good, but then they sort of give rights to people that might be seen as a deduction from the public good?
Yes. Well, don't think of collective goods. I don't like the word public good because that has a specific meaning in the theory. So laws are not public goods. They are collective goods, but not public goods. Don't view collective goods as a certain quantity or something. Everything is a collective good. Even private goods are collective goods in some sense because they are collectively defined, and their tradability is something that needs to be recognized. So the tradability of a good is also a collective good. So collective goods are an extremely broad category. It is everything that is involved with economic wealth creation that is not a commodity in some sense. And that includes the definition of a commodity. That includes whether something is a commodity or not. don't think of collective goods as government provided either. The provision of collective goods is not necessarily government at all. It is something collective, something that we have together. If you talk about culture, for example, how we do things, these are collective goods because these are intermediary goods that are used in the production of consumables, right? If we have a tradition of shaking hands, of writing contracts, this is an intermediary good for the creation of, for the production of goods, because the trade is sealed with a handshake. The contract is sealed with a handshake. It's a ritual, it's culture. It is not anything very economic in the sense of a quantity or something or the other, but it is a collective good. And it can be priced as a consequence. I can put a price on the handshake as a consequence. We can see how important it is. And people will have different views on that, but people will have views on it. So some people will say, without a handshake, there is no contract. Some others will say, I don't care whether there's a handshake or not. We will see that we can account for that and that we can still give a value to this. Yeah. So my story is probably totally different from any traditional story on public goods or collective goods. First of all, the category of things that are called public goods are much less broad. And secondly, I'm talking about really way of things, everything that is involved with the wealth creation process. And I think by including that into the discussion, the tradability of a good itself as a collective good, to be able to talk about it, we can put a price on the tradability of a good. We can give a value on that. And that is the main feature. Yeah? And we will see that in the next lecture, in the second hour, I will talk about that a little bit. I will talk about tradability of goods as an example of a collective good. Yeah. I hope I answered your question a little bit.
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Here,
Okay.
Rob, would
Yeah.
I ask, so are all social constructs then collective goods?
Yes. The straight answer is yes. Because they are collectively formed, they're collectively agreed, right? You submit to that. Whether you like it or not, that's a separate issue, but they are collectively created, and as a consequence, they are collective. Yeah, I hope. Yeah. So preference is independent of collectiveness, right? You have no preferences over intermediary goods in some sense, right? Unless they somehow affect you. The same holds for a lot of these collective goods. Yeah, so many of them will not touch us at all. And we never look at them as such. Yeah. All right, so here's a two-dimensional picture of these various things based on the properties that I talked about. I have on the one dimension non-tradables, intermediary goods and consumables. And on the other dimension, collectiveness of property rights. Now, the non-tradables versus intermediary goods versus consumables is a bit weird because, you know, the intermediary goods and consumables are not necessarily tradable either. But I lack a good word there for this category because non-tradables are with regard to maybe require a different kind of word, but this is an incomplete typology as a consequence. The collectiveness of property rights, I hope, is clear. Private versus communal versus collective. Communal hangs in between. It's all very fuzzy. because you can have big community, small community, and you have many layers in between, of course. And I give some words there that are common in the literature for these different type of categories. Now, what we have seen is our modeling only concerned 2 of those 9, as you can see, intermediary commodities and final consumption commodities. All the other categories were not really at play in the theory so far. What I will talk about mainly today is this final grouping on the collective side, and the commons, the natural resources, and the public goods. Public goods are usually consumables only. They are measurable, and so you can express quantities of the public good. And in the traditional models of public goods, it is also assumed that you have monotonicity in the quantity of the public good. So more is better. More of the public good is better. That is maybe not even with tradition. There are very few collective goods that are subject to that. In practice, more is better is not necessarily acceptable, right? With private goods, that's a different type of story, because if you don't like more, you just put it away, and it's a good idea. But if you talk about streetlights, for example, a typical traditional public good street lighting, if you more and more lights, you get light pollution, and there might be quite a few people that hate that. And so there is a saturation level with regard to street lighting. Too little street lighting is no good, but too much is also no good. So we are in between. We have maybe what is called single peaked preferences for that, right? There's a certain satiation going on, and that beyond that satiation point, you get declining preferences. You get lower and lower satisfaction for more and more streetlights. Yeah. So this is just an example of a very traditional public good. It is measurable because you can measure the number of streetlights there are, but more is not necessarily better, right? And it all depends on individuals as well. I mean, these are individual preferences that we talk about. Some people like more, some people like less. All of that needs to be taken into account with these collective goods. But we also know that you cannot say, if you have streetlights, you cannot exclude people from the streetlights. You know, streetlights are the streetlights, and some people will say, "What a bright light here," or some other people will say, "How dark it is." But you cannot exclude people from it. It is what it is, and you have different preferences. And what value should you put on that now? That's the main question that I want to ask in the next lecture, and that I try to give an answer to. A lot of collective goods, there are no preferences at all about. Those are the intermediary goods in some sense that are collectively owned, right? For example, land that is held in nature preserves that are not accessible to the public is a good example, right? So if there are no natural resources there, it is just a land or sea, for that matter, that is unexplored. There are fewer and fewer of those areas, of course, in our current circumstances in the world, but there were quite a few in the past, right? We have no preference over that. We don't care because we never visit. We don't know the value of it. And of course, the environmental crisis puts much more value on that, and it becomes more and more important. And then you see that these type of collective goods become more and more important. Let's talk about a few of these categories. The first category I want to talk about is public goods. I said already that there are 3 types of things related to that. This collective property rights, measurement, we can still measure how much of a public good there is, and non-exclusion in consumption, right? And these are consumables. Public goods are typically consumables. So typical examples are streetlights, defense expenditure, a nation state providing defense, policing, number of police officers on the road, on the street, enforcing the law, and road systems, for example. Public road systems can be measured, namely the number of miles of road constructed, where they're going, and so on. We can measure that quite well, and then the assumption that more is better, that is an additional assumption here. That is not necessarily the case. Yeah. Now, if measurement is more problematic, we can then talk about public projects. For example, parks, bridges, constitutions, that kind of thing. They are non-measurable, right? A bridge is very hard to measure. You can maybe measure its width, but its location, it is a project. A bridge is built, it's of a certain type, and you can choose between the different types. Yeah. Parks is the same thing, namely the features in a park, what defines a park. Is there, for example, a play area in the park? Are there benches in the park? Where are the paths? What type of trees are there in the park? If there's a play area in the park for children, what are we talking about? What kind of play instruments do we have? Constitutions, systems of law, governance itself, all these things are public projects. They are non-measurable, but they are consumed or intermediary goods, so to say. Then there's a second category, the in-between category that I said I will not talk about necessarily a lot, but I want to talk about it a little bit, and that is the communal property right category. When there are communal property rights. There are two categories, main categories of that, and that is club goods and local public goods. Now, club goods were first described by Buchanan. They refer to collective goods, collective projects that can be excluded. So privately owned clubs and estates, libraries are prime examples of that. You have to become a member. You have to pay a fee, usually, to be a member, and then you can use it. And you can also be excluded from it. Even when you pay your fees, you can still be excluded. I also want to include here a category that is usually not included as a club good, and that is firms, production organizations themselves. You have to be admitted, you can be excluded, you can be fired, right? But if you participate, you get a salary. It's a negative fee in some sense, but you need to offer your services. Your labor needs to be submitted to the firm, and the firm uses that in various ways to produce things and to be profitable. Yeah. So firms is an interesting category that can be recognized as a club good. Consumables from which agents can only weakly be excluded, or they are excluded because the distance from where they are to where they live is substantial. We then talk about local public goods, and local public goods usually refers to cities, towns, local councils providing services and providing amenities. Street lighting is really not a global public good, but it is really a local public good, for example. Social housing, churches, but also shops, those are really collective goods, right? We think of shops, for example, really as private things, but they are not. Because the door is open, and without an open door, there is no trade. So markets are typically local public goods. They're not club goods because people are not explicitly excluded. People can be excluded, but much harder. You can simply walk into the shop even when you got arrested for shoplifting and you were banned from the shop. It's very hard to enforce this exclusion. Yeah. Is that clear? Are there any questions about this category of goods? Okay. All right. So collective goods are typically provided by authorities. We always think of them provided by authorities. I also refer to collective goods that were provided by nobody, but were just conventions between us, like the handshake. Yeah. But a lot of these things are also privately provided. And when that is privately provided, we talk about the privatization of provision, for example. Yeah. And if private property rights can be defined and implemented, then you get a very specific form of privatization, namely market provision. And this then refers to Coase, the so-called Coase theorem. The Coase theorem is that you have a collective good that you somehow decompose into privately tradable commodities. So, for example, what is a very hot topic is pollution right markets. Right? Pollution is a big issue. It's a negative collective good, so to say. We want to curb that. Well, you can do that by having an authority impose that only a certain quantity of pollution can be released. However, they attach rights to that. So they create a set of rights, and the rights are brought to market and are traded. And when you purchase then a pollution right, you can then pollute up to a certain quantity that is specified in that right. So 500 tons of toxic waste or whatever can be disposed of in a certain way that is prescribed if you have that right and you have purchased that right on the market. This is the Coasian solution to providing a collective good. Yeah, and this is well known. So I will talk a little bit more in a minute about that, and that is the subject of semi-collective goods. This is a very specific construction because we talk about using something collective with a complementary good which is private, which is a standard commodity usually. Right? So the collective good is usually an infrastructure, and the complementary private good is usually a standard commodity. And the prime example is this road system, right? A road system is provided. This is the infrastructure, this is the collective good. And then you use that with a private vehicle, a car or a bike, anything that drives on wheels, you can use the road system for that. And so it is a pair. It is a collective good, which is an infrastructure, combined with a private good, a complementary private good that is a standard commodity. And one specific example of this is the Coasian solution. Yeah. Yeah. So semi-collective goods are extremely common. A lot of these infrastructures are provided by government. And then they're used by certain companies. And so the infrastructures are intermediary inputs to the production of whatever is outputted. This not only is road systems, but also air routes and air landing rights and all that, drilling rights. And then you use that with privately provided commodities. Yeah. And so this looks very much like the Gaussian market solution, because this is exactly what Coase is proposing. There is a collective infrastructure provided, and then private commodities are created that are hang together with that infrastructure, and then these private commodities can be utilized in that way. So an example is then this pollution rights market. The infrastructure is that the government provides a quantity of rights. A quantity of pollution is allowed, and then that is cut up into rights, and those rights are then traded, and then the right is a privately tradable commodity, right? But the infrastructure is the law that describes how much in total of the pollution can be emitted, so to say. Yeah. So that the Gaussian solution is a semi-collective good. From you restructure a collective good, a purely collective good, into a semi-collective good, and you reduce thereby the problems related to the collective good. Instead of having problems with everything, you now have problems only with the infrastructure, so to say, because the private commodities that are attached to it, there are no real issues with that, normally speaking. Yeah. Okay. So this was my typology. Now, there's an important footnote with this typology, namely, classical approaches to collective goods are not talking about collective goods from an institutional perspective at all. They talk about intrinsic properties of goods. And this is formulated as rivalry and exclusion. I already mentioned exclusion, but exclusion is an institutional feature. Rivalry is not necessarily an excludable feature. Rivalry means that if you use the collective good, you do not diminish it. If I walk in the park, I am not diminishing the park. I'm not using it up, so to say. A lot of collective goods are not like that at all. Even a park is not like that at all, because at some point, when more and more users there are using the park, there will be tremendous congestion. It will be a huge mess, and you will hate it. So you get tremendous diminishment of the enjoyment of the collective good. And a great example is Botanic Gardens, where you go on a beautiful day. There are tons of people there. It really is different from when you go there on a quiet, rainy day. Yeah, it's totally a different collective good that is provided. So rivalry is something that is brought up again and again, but it is not really true. The only thing that I can think of that is non-rivalrous is the fence, for example. But you don't need to talk about rivalry in the context of collective goods, in my opinion, because there's a perfectly good institutional way to talk about collective goods, and you don't need to talk about this rivalry. The rivalry shows up in the preferences, yeah, and those are there. Some people will hate it to go to a park when it is empty. Some people will hate it to go to a park when it is very busy. But the park is the park. And it is the institutional features of the park and its accessibility that defines it as a park. And one of these features is that it is weakly excludable in the sense that people need to have exert effort to go to the park. But there is not a gate at which there is a guard who can stop people and say, no, you're not allowed to go in unless you show me your license. You have also those kind of parks, but those are privately owned parks, and those are club goods, as we said. So I believe that collective goods are institutionally determined, not by the intrinsic commodities, the intrinsic properties of these commodities or the goods. Yeah. And I think it's a fallacy to believe that you can define things like that, because you blame a good for something instead of the humans that create a world in which that thing operates, so to say. Okay, so that's an important footnote. All right, it's a good moment to have a small break of a few minutes, just to catch a breath. Let's say we start again in 5 minutes. That's 53 after the hour. And then I will resume. All right, let's resume. Next, I want to talk about the provision of collective goods. They are tremendous. It's a tremendous problem in some sense, and I will talk about that. And usually they're provided by governments and local authorities, like I said. And then there is also the voluntary contribution mechanism that we have. People make contributions voluntarily, or they're taxed. One of those two ways we can use to finance the provision of collective goods. So those are the two main tools: voluntary contributions and taxation. We saw club goods, fees have to be paid to be a member of a club. The collective goods that are provided in that way are financed, of course, through those fees as well. Voluntary contribution is always insufficient. This is the key insight from traditional public economics. Either there is under provision or there is over extraction. Right? It depends on what the context is of the collective good. Under provision, for example, if people had to provide their own streetlights, there would be too few streetlights. Yeah, and we can see that in rural areas where there are no streetlights provided. Some people will provide street light because they think it's important, and some other people will not. And so usually there is an issue with that. Over extraction refers, of course, to natural resources, fishing grounds, for example. Overfishing is the standard issue, right? And if you do not somehow control that, the whole fishing stock might tremendously diminish, and there might be nothing left at some point. Now, this voluntary provision issue, that there is always under provision over extraction, is called the tragedy of the commons. And this refers to the very first time this was brought up in 1968. It was in a paper that described in an anecdotal fashion that in medieval times in villages you had common grounds for grazing animals mainly. There are also common grounds to grow vegetables, for example. And so everybody could put their animal on the common ground. And what would typically happen is that people would put animals on the common ground first, and only second on their own ground, on their own property. And as a consequence, you got overgrazing of the commons, and the commons deteriorated tremendously. It became just a mud field, essentially. Yeah. Now, this is everywhere around us. Everywhere we see commons issues. Let me give you an example. Money. Money is a collective good. I want to first start off with a remark. Until now, I did not talk a lot about money in the theory. I always talked about a numeraire commodity. A numeraire commodity is not money, right? A numeraire commodity is nothing but a theoretical unit of account. So everything that we did in these production networks, when we put prices there, it was all expressed in a certain unit of account. And so you got exchange rates essentially expressed in that unit of account, and that is what we call the price. But it is not money, because money is much more than that. Money is not only for exchange, but it is also for financing, right? And a financial instrument is a typical collective good. We together determine whether something is functioning as such or not. Yeah. Now, for a very, very long time, money was privately provided. This is called commodity money, right? So commodity money was created for the first time in Lydia in the 3rd century BC. Lydia was a very rich country, had a lot of gold and silver, and they started to use the gold and the silver as a unit of account, but also a unit of financialization. And so money became, this commodity became the big tool to let the economy run. Now, typically, you can use your own gold and silver to put to use as money, but you can also extract money from the money supply, gold and silver, of course. You can just hoard it in some sense. And that's exactly what people did, of course, also. So we talk about private regulation of the quantity of money that is going around, and we have private provision of money. And what was the typical consequence of that? You got monetary crisis after monetary crisis. One of the big issues of the pre-modern economy before capitalism, before the Industrial Revolution, was that there was great financial instability. And that had several causes, but the main one is private provision. And that we had several commodities at the same time, namely the gold and the silver usually. Those are two commodities that were desirable, but there was a problem. Namely, gold is clearly more valuable than silver. You could buy more with gold than with silver. And so people preferred to hoard gold and use the silver. And so you got Gresham's law. Inferior money drives out good money. And Gresham's law can be used for other things as well, right? If you have competing substitutes, so to say, Gresham's law is nearly always at work, right? There is a social understanding of one commodity to the other when they're substitutes. And the good one is usually withdrawn from the market, and the bad one is put on the market, so to say. Another example is Akerlof's lemons market, where this is about cars. You had second-hand cars. You had good ones, which are called the peaches, and you had the bad ones, which are called the lemons. And there were no peaches traded. There were always lemons traded. And why is that? Why is the second-hand car market a market for lemons? And essentially, it's Gresham's law. Now, at some point, government stepped in, and this is related to the Industrial Revolution. The emergence of the nation state is one of the big features of industrialization of capitalism. The nation state took control, and it took control of the financial system. And it essentially regulated money. And as soon as you start to regulate money, you get fiat money. So one of the first things nation-state governments did was introduce worthless coins to replace silver and to hoard the gold in a common treasury, right? So a vault with the gold of the country, yeah? And so officially all this money was related to gold, but the gold was held by government. And so you got a gold standard, as it was called, yeah? And so you get indirect commodity money in some sense. It is government regulated. It is the government sets how much grains of gold are related to what coin. And it became the main tool in the classical capitalist era, in the 19th century in particular. Now, the gold standard was abandoned in the First World War, and they tried to restore it after the First World War. And this became a huge failure. So in the 1930s, the gold standard led to tremendous crises. It really deepened the Great Depression. Yeah. The gold standard was abandoned again. We had Second World War, and after the Second World War, it was reintroduced as the Bretton Woods system. And the Bretton Woods system ultimately did not function either because of the issue of gold. It is that you had this commodity that was in the vaults somewhere, and now it was related only to the dollar, and the dollar was convertible in gold officially, and all the other coins were convertible in dollars. So you got a two-tier system where the dollar was the one that was convertible into gold, and all the other coins were convertible in the dollar. This collapsed in 1971. So it was still the commodity money remains an issue. Now, more recently, we have seen that we got real fiat money after 1971. Pure fiat money in the sense that it is completely uncontrolled. It is supposed to be controlled by the central banks, but that regulation is quite weak. Banks and financial institutions just freely create money at the moment. And this is also a big problem because you get simply too much money. And as a consequence, your interest rates are going through the floor. They become even negative in some cases. There's simply too much of that stuff. And you get tremendous inflation in certain areas of the economy. And in particular, the policies have really been pushing for inflation in the financial markets, especially past decade. The financial markets have exploded and not related to economic performance at all. Those are more and more divorced from that. And housing markets worldwide have exploded as well. All the other markets are much less affected, and that is related to the financialization issues with regard to real estate and, of course, financial markets. Those are directly related to the financialization. Money is and remains a huge problem, whether it is government regulated, whether it's government provided, whether it is privately provided. All of it has issues. And this is a typical story of collective goods. Collective goods, it doesn't matter what you talk about. There are always problems. You cannot solve it, period. There are, even with streetlights, with parks, there are problems. And there are whole debates about it, and there are fights about it, and usually it's not solved. Yeah. Let me show you the problems that there are with private provision by doing a mathematical example. This is this standard tragedy of the commons game. Let's say we have a consumable commons of size gamma, and there are two agents, and they can extract from this commons. Yeah. So the extraction is called X sub I, but this is the use of the commons, right? So this is a negative collective good in some sense. The more you keep of the collective good, the commons, the more there is for the future, right? If I only use a little bit, there is much more for it to be used in the future because it is much better preserved. If I use a lot, tomorrow's commons is much diminished, much less value, and much less as an input for a production process. This is reflected in the utility functions that we assign here. These are the game theoretic payoff functions, namely, what is determining my preference? It is a Cobb-Douglas function, x times y, where x is today's extraction from the commons, x1, x2, and y is what is left over for the future, how well the commons is preserved. And so that becomes then gamma minus the total usage from the commons today, which is x1 plus x2. So the product of those two is my utility. Yeah. Okay, so that is what I just said. Now we can compute the socially optimal extraction. Namely, I add up the two payoffs and I will maximize the total extraction over that sum of the payoffs, the sum of the utility functions. We assume here that you can do that. You can reformulate that. You get x1 plus x2 times the same factor, namely gamma minus x1 plus x2. Yeah. And so we can formulate that as E times gamma minus E, where E is x1 plus x2. You can then optimize that over E, and you can see that E should be gamma over 2. And then the total wealth is then gamma squared over 4. Yeah. A typical example of usage is then the equal usage, namely you divide that gamma over 2 by 2, and you say both of them equally can extract from the commons. And so the extraction becomes, the individual extraction becomes gamma divided by 4. And so the individual utility becomes then gamma squared divided by 8. So there are other solutions as well. Any sum that adds up to gamma over 2 is a solution. So there are many, many Pareto optimal extraction possibilities here. Let's see the individually optimal extraction. So what happens when we let individuals just make decisions? Well, you get then a Nash equilibrium of this extraction game. Each individual does a best response to what the other individual is doing. So what does that mean? I maximize my payoff given what the other is using of the commons. So given x2, I'm maximizing the payoff for 1, which is x1 times gamma minus x1 minus x2. So you get then that there is a best response is to use half of whatever is left. And for the other person, it is the same. You then take both best responses into account, and you can then derive that there is a unique Nash equilibrium emerging, and that is that each of these guys will extract 1/3 of the commons, and their utility as a consequence is gamma squared over 9, which is less than the Pareto optimal usage. So what we see here is that we have a non-optimal Nash equilibrium, a Nash equilibrium that is Pareto inferior to a Pareto solution, so to say. Yeah. So we have the famous over-extraction from the commons confirmed in this particular case. This is the standard case. This is the law of collective goods. When the collective goods are privately provided, there is always over-extraction or under-provision. And this commons example shows that. Now, what is the normal solution? Government regulation. Government comes in and puts a big fence around the commons and regulates who can enter and who cannot, and how much can be used from the commons. Yeah, and so they can enforce this. And one of the possibilities that they can do this is the quotient solution. They can make it a semi-collective good. Namely, they can set an extraction level, and then they can create a private commodity called extraction rights. And you can trade the extraction rights in a regular commodity market at which a price will emerge. And as long as the extraction rights add up to this optimal level, namely the half of the commons is used in total, you have an Pareto optimal situation. This is exactly what is done for pollution. And this is exactly what is done for fishing rights, fishing grounds, the use of fishing grounds. Fishing grounds are, of course, wonderful examples of commons as well. Yeah. However, the government really has to restrict the usage of these things, otherwise it goes really wrong. They did that extremely well with fishing grounds because they have preserved the fishing grounds. There was a time in the 70s that there was nearly no fish left in the North Sea, for example. At that time, the European Economic Community, as it was still called at that time, which included also the UK at that time, stepped in and started this restriction of the use of the North Sea for fishing. And they were able to revive the species of fish through very strict policies and regulation. But they were able to revive it. And so now we have a long-term stable situation in the North Sea. With regard to pollution, that is not necessarily the case. There has been lobbying and all that stuff, and governments usually provide pollution rights. And so you get more pollution than really should be, regardless of what kind of treaties they sign in Paris or wherever they get together. Yeah. All right. This was private provision and the issues related to private provision. The alternative to private provision is the government provision of collective goods. The government levies a tax. The tax is used to provide a certain good. Let's say streetlights, let's say an army for defense. Those are typical examples. Yeah. Of course, they aim to provide a socially optimal level, but it is extremely hard, especially with those issues of streetlights of an army, because what the heck is an optimal level here? You have to ask everybody in principle, and then they might not even get the right answers, right? And that is exactly what we are looking at here. We have a huge problem with optimal taxation and also optimal provision, because people will hide what their feelings are about it. They will lie about their preferences to avoid being taxed, to avoid being that the thing is that they have to pay for it, so to say. Yeah. Yeah. So there's a fundamental incentive problem if you have centralized provision of collective goods. Either individual agents have no preferences because they don't care, or when they have preferences, they will misrepresent it and they will lie about it. And there are major differences between different agents with regard to their preferences, with regard to those collective goods. And so you get a huge problem of fair taxation when we talk about fees, or we get a huge problem with the provision of the collective good at the right level. What is Pareto optimal here? This is called the free rider problem. The free rider problem is really about this incentive problem to get people to reveal their preferences and their willingness to contribute or the willingness to pay with regard to those collective consumables. Yeah. So is there a fair taxation even possible? Well, theoretically there is, and it is called the Lindahl model. And this is the foundation for what I will talk about in the second hour today. The Lindahl model is that everybody should be taxed individually based on their individual preferences for these collectively provided consumables. And we are only talking about consumables here. We are not talking about intermediary goods. We're not talking about things that people don't care about with regard to their well-being. We only talk about things that pop up in their utility functions. Yeah. So that's already a restriction by itself. But everybody in principle pays a different tax based on their own individual preferences. And Lindahl was the first to talk about that. Lindahl was, by the way, a civil servant in the Swedish government at the beginning of the 20th century. And he wrote essentially a policy paper at that time. It was not an academic paper necessarily, but he proposed this individual taxation as a correct model to address this issue. Now, if that is true, it gives a justification for wealth-based taxation, because preferences can be thought of as being related to wealth or income. And so income tax and wealth tax can be justified in that way. And we talk about, of course, that in exactly that period that Lindahl wrote that paper, talk about the years around the First World War, taxation systems were introduced on income and wealth for the first time. So for example, in the United States, a federal income tax was created in 1913, at the same time that the Federal Reserve was created. So it was around this time. And Lindahl was the justification for that in some sense. Yeah. Now, variations of the theory, Lindahl's theory, can have been developed for local public goods, for club goods, for semi-public goods, semi-collective goods, the infrastructure together with the commodity, and abstract collective projects, where it is called valuation equilibrium. And that is the foundation, valuation equilibrium is the foundation for what we talk about in the next hour, by the way. Yeah. So Lindahl's model is very powerful from a theoretical point of view. It namely says that if you are able to tax people fairly and individually, based on their preferences, and that you know their true preferences, you get a full implementation possible of Pareto optimal situations, Pareto optimal levels of provisions of collective goods. And those are called the welfare theorems. Yeah. Lindahl's model is mathematically beautiful because it is the complete dual to the standard market theory model of pricing. So market pricing models of standard commodities. The mathematical dual of that is Linden's model. But it is all a wonderful theoretical exercise that cannot be really implemented except through income tax and wealth tax, under the idea that income drives preferences. But even that has been given up in some sense in the recent decades. And we know that wealth has been undertaxed tremendously in the past decades. And we live in this kind of unfair world in which a lot of very wealthy individuals are able to hide their wealth and their income from the agencies that are enforcing the taxation laws in the various countries. So problems, 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 huge problems. Okay, let's return to the commons. And I want to talk about a certain thing that shows you the pitfalls of the whole enterprise of collective goods. Namely, what if agents are not fully rational? There's a lot of development in theory in economics on decision-making under various models of boundedly rational behavior. If you take into account that people are not fully rational, what can happen then? And I want to show you that for the commons, because that is a very simple situation. And this was a paper that I developed with a colleague of mine, Dimitrios Diamantaris, on the commons. And we look at exactly the same model that we had before. We have two economic agents, and they're using a commons. And the standard thing is there's overuse. However, what happens now if these economic agents are not fully rational? They are maybe have feelings of optimism or pessimism with regard to actions related to the commons. Yeah. How will that affect the situation? This is called ambiguity. So ambiguity theory is focusing on how decision makers view the other decision makers, whether they are optimistic or pessimistic with regard of the behavior of the other decision makers. They take into account that the other decision makers might be irrational, whether they behave that way or not. I leave that in the middle, but you expect these guys to, with a certain degree, to be behaving very well or very badly with regard to my situation. And that is called ambiguity. It's a very specific form of bounded rationality. And what will happen under those conditions? We can model that very explicitly by modifying the payoff functions in the game. And we do that then with regard to introducing specific functions to describe really optimistic feelings and really pessimistic feelings. So what is the worst that the other decision maker can do to me? And what is the best that the other decision maker can do to me? So fully optimistic beliefs are formulated as what can this other decision maker do to make me really happy? Well, that is to maximize my payoff with regard to a certain level of usage that I have, X1. And it doesn't matter what X1 is. If you use that quadratic formulation that we had before, the Cobb-Douglas function, you will see that there is only one value for X2 that makes player one or decision maker number one extremely happy, and that is that the other guy stays away from the commons. And that is what we formulate here, right? So what is the payoff when I use the commons at level X1 if the other guy stays away? That is capital M1. That is that function. And it is X1 times the size of the commons minus x1. And the others has exactly the same, of course. Right? So these are ideal situations for these players. There's also the worst possible of all worlds, and that is that the other guy uses all of the commons. So the worst thing that can happen is that the other guy uses all of the commons, and then I get a negative utility even, right? So if I use the commons with x1 and there's nothing left, I just have costs in all regards. I will just have misery because my animals die, and that is not something that I appreciate. Yeah. So the payoff function that belongs to that is negative x1 squared. Same for the other guy. So those are two extreme propositions. Now, what am I going to do? I'm going to now mix these extremes with my standard payoff function. I introduce two parameters, a lambda and a mu, and those are weights, and I put a certain weights on being fully optimistic. I put a certain weight on being fully pessimistic, and then the remainder of the weight I put on the standard payoff function, standard utility function. So lambda is a degree of optimism that I have, and mu is a degree of pessimism. And I'm assuming that these degrees add up to at most 1. But usually these degrees can be quite small, although they can be positive, of course. Yeah. Are there any questions with regard to this model? So introducing these kind of irrational elements into the payoff function makes this decision problem suddenly boundedly rational, as it is called. And it reflects better real-life persons making decisions. They are, we all are conflicted by feelings of optimism, pessimism, and rationality. And this payoff function mixes that. Now we can do the standard thing. I can compute the equilibrium of this commons gain using these modified payoff functions. Things become much more complicated because we have all these lambdas and the mu's, but we can draw some conclusions. The first one is that for every lambda there is some mu, or every lambda between 0.5. If lambda becomes too large, the pessimism takes over, so to say. You can have a socially optimal extraction from the commons. Yeah. This is symmetric ambiguity, by the way. Both have exactly the same degrees of optimism and pessimism. Yeah. So there are combinations here of degrees of optimism and pessimism such that I can make the extraction exactly optimal, socially optimal. That's the main lesson, and I can do that. Yeah. However, we are not in control of the mu and the lambda, right? These are in the brains of our decision makers in some sense. Yeah. If you look at low values of mu, low values of degrees of pessimism, then it doesn't matter what the lambda is, you get always over extraction of the commons, which seems plausible because people are not that pessimistic about using the commons. Yeah. For slightly higher values of this degree of pessimism, you get a cutoff point. You get a lambda sub mu where there's social optimal extraction. And then for the lambdas less than lambda mu, there's under extraction. And for lambda larger than lambda mu, there's over extraction. And so you get these different patterns emerging. For high levels of pessimism, there is under extraction from the commons. Doesn't matter what Lapta is in some sense. Yeah, it is all because we are so pessimistic in some sense. Yeah. So pessimism in general leads to under extraction. Optimism leads to over extraction. That's the lesson here in the symmetric case. And you can balance the optimism and the pessimism to get exactly a socially optimal extraction from the commons. However, we are not in control of the Lapta and the mu, right? The best we can do is try to steer it a bit, but it shows you, this model shows you what is driving, in some sense, decision-making that leads to suboptimal behavior. And it is very plausible, as you can see here. Now, what about opposites, antipodal ambiguity? Let's say one is a pessimist and the other is an optimist, right? Now, in that case, there is always over extraction from the commons. So it doesn't matter what the degrees of optimism or pessimism of these individuals are, because they think differently about the situation. You get always over extraction, which is also very interesting, because you would not necessarily expect that. Because if you have a very pessimistic person on one hand and only a slightly optimistic person on the other hand, and they both are in the game, you still get over extraction. Right? If the degree of optimism of our optimist, so to say, increases, then the over extraction increases. And the pessimist will even extract less, but this is completely subsumed in the over extraction of the optimist. And if the pessimist becomes more pessimistic, then the over extraction decreases, but the optimist extracts more and more. Yeah. All right. Okay. Are there any questions with regard to this ambiguity story? So the purpose of the story is just to give you a flavor of all the issues that play in the real world. It's a mathematical example that tells a story, and the story is things are much more complicated even than these models of rational behavior would predict, because this kind of boundedly rational behavior, which is quite common, namely feelings of optimism and pessimism, are very much driving business, right? Entrepreneurs are optimistic people, right? Otherwise, they would not be doing that. If you're a pessimist, you would seek a safe job in a company, a large corporation possibly, and you would be hiding there, so to say. Yeah. It's just a story to show you that in life, things are much more complicated even than the theory would predict with regard to rational behavior. So collective goods always have problems. There is a huge issue with collective goods, and all the debates in our economy are always about collective goods, even when they are privatized, so to say. Yeah? Nobody is having a debate about markets for apples. It is always the issue of pollution. It is the issue of governance, government itself, how it is behaving, how it is acting, and those related issues of collective goods. Yeah. So, to be more precise, voluntary provision is extremely difficult. There's always under provision, over usage. It's very fragile. It can even be more complex when you take into account there boundedly rational behavior. Yeah. Socially optimal provision of collective goods is purely accidental, purely theoretical. It is virtually impossible, whether you do that through a government with trying to impose fair taxation or not, trying to get even a determination of what is a socially optimal provision of a collective good is impossible. Yeah, because you ask people how you feel about this. What do you think? And they will lie about it because they have incentives to lie about it. Yeah. Right, so it becomes even more complex than it already is when you take into account other elements in this decision making. It's very hard to detect sometimes what drives people, what exactly is behind things. So I was really struggling and still struggling really very much about, for example, Brexit. What is the purpose of Brexit from a perspective of the economy of the UK, right? And the custody of the economy of the UK that should be done by a government. Why would you do Brexit? And Brexit is a collective good. Those are very interesting questions, and the answer is not so obvious, because still today I have great difficulty understanding why somebody would be in favor of Brexit, in particular business people. But then in the background maybe is the issue that that they are not completely rational. Yeah. All right. Are there any questions related to the definition of collective goods, the stories of collective goods, the problems of collective goods that I talked about? Then in the next hour, I will talk about the theory of valuation of collective goods. I will do a general, set up some general principles of how to value collective goods. This is a quite complex story in some sense. And then I will do a number of applications of that. And hopefully the applications show you some very interesting insights, also of the nature of collective goods, etc. Yeah. Okay, if there are no questions, let's have a break. Let's go to 5 to 4, 15-minute break from now. 5 to 4 we resume, and hopefully I can do it within an hour, this story of the valuations. Okay, so I see you in 15 minutes again.